Despite China's labor problems, our next guest says the country's success has been paid for with U.S. jobs. In the past hour, I spoke with Scott Paul, the executive director at the Alliance for American Manufacturing. I asked him if jobs are leaving the U.S., what type of manufacturing can it expect to retain and build in the future?
It's a good question, and I think the answer is a lot more than people might think. Booz Allen Hamilton, a consulting firm, recently did a study that showed about 94% of all U.S. manufacturing is globally cost competitive. I think we should certainly focus on strategic industries, look at clean energy. The automotive sector is very important. Things where you need to be close to the customer, high technology, but we should not give up on our traditional industries. We have a cost advantage in a lot of manufacturing, and I think that's a surprising fact for a lot of people.
With China, you're suggesting there's no JFK, John F. Kennedy, or Ronald Reagan, basically no strategy coming from the White House these days. Specifically, what are the recommendations? What would you do differently?
Well, I think what we see from the White House is a proper focus on military strategy, and I do think that they have a smarter strategy than they did a couple years ago with regard to military strategy and particularly in the Pacific Rim and the South China Sea. But where we need a plan is economically, and that is my major criticism. We have a $295 billion trade deficit with China last year. It's a record. It's very imbalanced. China has more than $2 trillion in currency reserves. It finances about 9% of our debt. We are highly leveraged, and that certainly limits our options strategically in a lot of ways. We need to have consequences if China's not playing by the rules, and I do believe that China can be a friend, can be a trade partner, but I think it has to start with an honest discussion and not simple, not refried promises that we've seen, in particular over the last couple of days from Mr. Xi. I think we really need to make progress, and I think there have to be consequences in order to make that progress.
What are you suggesting in terms of job losses right now? Because I know President Obama is suggesting insourcing to provide tax incentives, for example, to manufacturers to increase jobs nationally. It sounds very protectionist. What are the numbers that the U.S. has lost over the last decade or 5 years?
Right. Well, on insourcing, every country has incentives to try to keep jobs in their country. The United States is kind of unique in the feature that we don't. And so for the president to propose insourcing incentives, I think is a good thing. I don't think it's protectionist at all. I just think it's smart. Companies respond to incentives. They do all over the world, and it would be ridiculous for us not to have any. In terms of the numbers, we've seen 370,000 manufacturing jobs created since January of 2010. We saw 50,000 manufacturing jobs created in January. That's the highest one-month total we've seen in 13 years. But that's a drop in the bucket compared to what we lost over the last decade. We lost fully a third of our manufacturing jobs, 5.5 million jobs. And as our trade deficit with China rose, that has become the main culprit. And we'll never have a renaissance in American manufacturing unless we get the trade relationship with China correct.
Well, I've watched Germany very carefully, and over the last 5 years, Scott, their exports to China have surged on average 30% a year with a similar cost base to America. Some would argue that America is not exporting the right products. Why can Germany grow to China and the U.S. not?
It's a very good question, because in Germany, the manufacturing wages are higher. It's not a low regulatory environment. Face many of the same cost pressures as we do in the United States. But Germany has a strategy, and they do focus on the things they do well. And we've been reluctant to do that, to have this sort of industrial policy in the United States. I think it's a word that many people don't know exactly what it means. I think that a smart industrial policy is exactly what the United States means. I think we can be competitive. We have this enormous trade deficit, $295 billion with China. Germany has balanced trade with China. They are also a lot tougher on Chinese imports than we are. But I think there are many things to admire about the German approach to their trade policy with China. We need to get smarter about what we are manufacturing. It needs to be high value.
Once again, Scott Paul for the Alliance for American Manufacturing joining us earlier from New York. Well, riots in Athens would make anyone